excited to bring our speaker to you tonight. So let's get through some of the fun stuff. Let's go ahead and have our translator talk about translation in case you need that.
Okay. Muy buenas. Muy buenas tardes. Bienvenidos a esta noche, a esta segunda noche de la serie de pláticas por el mes de la herencia hispana. Esta noche el tema es Unidos, integración para una nación más fuerte. Si necesitan interpretación en español, por favor haga clic en el icono de interpretación y seleccione español. Muchas gracias y bienvenidos.
Gracias. Thank you so much. And welcome again, Mr. Hernandez. Can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. Okay, so we are here celebrating National Hispanic Heritage Month from September 15th to October 15th. And our previous speaker, Anita Quiñones-Gabrielian, did an amazing job last week of explaining why it is during these weeks. And so please check out the recording that we have for her on our website. And you can learn all about that. Next slide, Mr. Hernandez. Okay, we are going to hear a message from our superintendent. And we can't hear her.
Is Dr. Carlos Haro with us today to share his passion and expertise with our Glendale Unified community. We are honored to be joined by such a dynamic and influential leader whose many accomplishments align so closely with our Glendale Unified mission and values. Our district proudly partners with UCLA on many initiatives to support our students' academic growth, health, and well-being. Additionally, Dr. Haro's Scholarship Fund works to elevate student success and supports UCLA students in the field of Chicano education. Our dedicated Adelante Latinos organization is proud to work towards supporting the education of our Hispanic and Latinx students by providing incredible academic and scholarship opportunities. I'm proud of our amazing Adelante Latinos leaders for everything you do to uplift and advance our Hispanic and Latinx students. And of course, enormous thanks to our incredible speaker, Dr. Carlos Haro. Welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Ektian. So I wanted to say a quick thank you to all of our speakers, as well as the people who introduced us to our speakers, Jenny Quiñones-Skinner, Natalia Lewis, Marisol Cianello, who is very near and dear to Dr. Haro, I believe, Dr. Adriana Guerra Pastangi, our Adelante Latinos Club, and our co-chair people, Francesca Silva and Miguel Gonzalez, as well as our fundraising chair, Brenda Besserell. Again, thank you to Dr. Ektian. I have to say that none of this would happen without her support. When she came to this district, she really worked with Adelante Latinos and has just been such fuel in our fire. So I'm very thankful to her and our board members. I also want to thank Glendale Public Libraries for partnering with us. And you're going to be hearing more from them as we look towards Dia de los Muertos. We'll be working with them on that event as well. And tonight we have our student moderators, Giovanna Aldaz, and is Aaron here too? No, Giovanna. Okay, so Giovanna's here. So welcome, Giovanna. And I believe I'm going to hand it over to you so you can introduce our speaker.
Okay. So now we're going to present our speaker today, Dr. Carlos Haro. He is the Assistant Director Emeritus and Postdoctoral Scholar at the UCLA Chicano Studies Research Center. Raised in the Boyle Heights area of East Los Angeles, he graduated from Roosevelt High School and then attended UCLA, where he received 3 degrees, including a doctorate from the UCLA Graduate School of Education. He joined the staff of UCLA in 1975 and remained with the university his entire professional career. He He continues his affiliation with UCLA as Assistant Director Emeritus and Postdoctoral Scholar at the UCLA Chicano Studies Research Center. Dr. Haro and his family have been residents of the city of Montebello since 1977. He has a long history of public service and now serves on the Beverly Hospital Board of Directors. He was appointed to the board in 2008 and served for 7 years as the chair of the board of directors from 2010 to 2017. Dr. Haro is also a member of the Montebello Ashaya Sister Cities Association, where he served as president for 5 years and established both the Elaine Kirkner Scholarship Fund for Montebello Student Ambassadors and the Ye Aihara Montebello Host Family Fund. Other community and public service includes a term on the State Bar of California, Committee of Bar Examiners, appointed as a public member by the Board of Governors, State Bar from 1980 to 1981. Also in 1980, he was appointed by the Superior Court Judge Paul Egley to serve on the Los Angeles School District's Desegregation Monitoring Committee. And in 1981, he served as chair of the committee. He was also on the Board of Trustees of Immaculate Heart College Center for 11 years. He served for 17 years and chair for 2 terms of the Board of Directors of La Clínica Familiar del Barrio, the Community Health Services Center that became AltaMed Health Services Corporation in 1990. AltaMed is now the largest Latino nonprofit health services organization on the West Coast. In 2008, Dr. Haro retired from UCLA after nearly 33 years on the staff, during which he served as the Assistant Dean of UCLA's International Studies and overseas programs for 18 years, and as Program Director of the UCLA Chicano Studies Research Center from 1975 to 1983, and then as Assistant Director of the Center from 2002 to 2008. Dr. Haro has continued his affiliation with the university and serves as Assistant Director Emeritus and as Postdoctoral Scholar in Residence at the UCLA CSRC. Upon his retirement from UCLA, the CSRC established the Carlos M. Haro Scholarship Fund to support UCLA graduate students conducting research in the area of Chicano education. There is also a special archival collection at UCLA, the Carlos M. Haro Collection on the Crawford desegregation case. The collection was donated to the UCLA Chicano Studies Research Center Library and Archive and includes materials that Dr. Haro collected for research he was conducting for the publication Mexicano/Chicano Concerns and School Desegregation in Los Angeles in 1977, and materials he compiled while on the LA School Desegregation Monitoring Committee. Now please welcome Dr. Carlos Haro.
Thank you for that introduction, and many thanks to Adelante Latino for inviting me to talk with you today. I also very much appreciate the comments that Anita Quiñones provided last week. I'm going to leap from those comments and make my comments as a continuation of some of the things that she said. Next week, you'll be meeting with Ignacio Gomez, a good friend of mine and an artist, a muralist, a sculptor, and I think you'll find his comments most interesting. Next slide, please. Now, the resume that you've been provided doesn't really go into detail in terms of my experiences. And I want to discuss today in the form of a testimonio, an oral history of some of the experiences that I had, primarily in the 1960s and the 1970s, experiences that are relevant for today's education. Next slide. I was born in Tucson, Arizona. I would be the 5th generation born in Tucson in my mother's side. My father was born in Nogales, Sonora, on the other side of the border. So I have experience along La Frontera between Mexico and the United States. Next slide. I would spend summers in my adolescence over in the Nogales side with my grandmother, my father's mother. And each of these summers I learned not only the language, but more about the culture of Mexico. Now here, the Nogales crossing looks congested, and it is. Today, the Nogales crossing from Nogales, Sonora to Nogales, Arizona is very different than what it was when I was a youth, moving back and forth across the border. I remember crossing the border and simply waving at the border guard. No papers. It's not like the political issue that it is today. We had family on both sides. Next slide. But one thing I was reminded of each and every summer that I spent in Mexico, that the border was invisible in many ways. Because the Southwest, from Texas to California, all of that land at one time was Mexico. And that families were separated. But in many ways, the border didn't exist. Not until today. Next slide. Now let's move over to the 1960s. I'm going to Roosevelt High School. It was an old structure, an old campus built in the 1920s and hadn't changed much into the 1960s. It was a campus not built for the large enrollment that it had in the 1960s. And that enrollment reflected the inflow of a large number of Mexicans and Mexican Americans, people born in the United States of Mexican origin. Large overflow. It was overcrowded. Old facilities, old library, old books. The campus was too small. And an additional problem was it was not preparing the students for a future. It was not preparing students for college or for university studies. Relatively few were able to get into the college preparatory courses. I was fortunate, I was. Next slide. One fortunate thing for me was that I lived and went to school in an area called Boyle Heights. Boyle Heights is east of the Los Angeles River. And downtown Los Angeles is slightly west of the Los Angeles River. But in Boyle Heights, for a time, it was a diverse community. And by going to school, in the schools in Boyle Heights, I was able to interact with different racial groups, different ethnic groups. It was a wonderful opportunity to interact with others that were not like me. Diversity allowed me to grow. Next slide. Here I am, 1964, a junior, but I did not know where I was going to go to college or if I was going to go to college at all, even though I was in the college prep stream. Then one of my instructors asked me, an old Irishman, Mr. Kelly, asked me, Carlos, where are you going to go to school? And I answered, I didn't know. And he looked at me and said, you're going to apply and you're going to go to UCLA. And why was that? Well, he had confidence in me and my ability, but also he was a UCLA alumni. Next slide. Here's Roosevelt today, a thoroughly modern campus, completely different from the school that I experienced in 1964 and 65. I've done some work with the new Theodore Roosevelt High School. There is an exhibit that I curated and that's up at the campus library. And for those that are interested, you can go to Roosevelt and see one of my exhibits. It's on the 1968 student walkouts. Next slide. On to UCLA. Of course, this is not the new UCLA. This is the UCLA that opened in 1929, Royce Hall. And I have learned that some of the bricks that were used in the construction of UCLA came out of the east side. So there we are, East Los Angeles at UCLA. It was the southern branch of the University of California. UC Berkeley, of course, the northern branch. And this is the beginning of UCLA. Next slide. The campus was relatively small in the beginning. And now, of course, it's surrounded by some of the most expensive property in the Los Angeles area, Brentwood and Bel Air. But UCLA has become a powerhouse as a university. It is the #1 public institution of higher education, ranked #1 for several years now. Next slide. But one of the men that made UCLA gain recognition for UCLA nationally and internationally was this man in the middle, Coach John Wooden. And anyone that knows college sports knows that name. Probably the greatest college basketball player of all time. Next slide. While I met John Wooden, I also met one of the greatest basketball players of all time. Came to UCLA under the name of Lou Alcindor, left UCLA with the name Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Next slide. But there was a lot going on in the 60s, a great deal going on, challenges to our society, changes that were occurring. The Vietnam War was going on, and the anti-war movement, especially at colleges and universities among the young. Social unrest. There was civil rights movement, especially for African Americans. The women's movement, the farm worker union movement and huelgas and boycotts, a free speech movement among students that began at the University of California at Berkeley. The international student movement. Students were acting up around the world. In Europe, in Paris, the student movement closed down the city. There was also a student movement in Mexico and other Latin American countries. Unfortunately, the student movement in Mexico and in other parts, other countries, also became violent. And in 1968, it's estimated that over 300 students, demonstrators, were killed by the Mexican military. So it was dangerous, as well as activists trying to assure that their position was being heard. There was a student movement in the United States, and I participated in that. But we also felt the 1968 murders of both Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy. We felt that in our hearts. Now, another change that occurred in the 1960s was the baby boomer generation moving on into colleges and universities, moving on to higher education. But during the 60s, for the first time in the history of higher education, they started to admit minority students in significant numbers. Very small numbers, but significant enough to create a core of high-achieving students from barrio schools, for example, at a university. Next slide. Activities at UCLA. UCLA was a hub of student activism. And this is a document, a publication that celebrated 40 years of ethnic studies at UCLA in 2009. A great deal going on. Next slide. Student activism flourished. Students organized. Students acted. And you see a photograph down in the lower section, but next slide. There's a close-up of it. This is a photograph of me, 2009. Next slide. UMAS was the organization that was organized by Mexican-American students. There were chapters in various campuses. This is 1968. United Mexican-American Students demand that the UCLA chancellor at that time, Franklin Murphy, suspend a fraternity for gross racist behavior. That's what we were alleging. That's what we were charging. And we wanted that fraternity suspended. Next slide. But the anti-war demonstrations were huge at UCLA and at other campuses. Next slide. One particular part of UCLA's history was the Angela Davis situation, her case. She was a lecturer in the philosophy department. And our chancellor was pressed to fire her because she was a communist. He would not. Chancellor Charles Young. Young was the chancellor that I knew almost all of my student years and into the years that I was on the staff at UCLA. He would not fire her. So he came into conflict with the regents of the University of California and also with the governor at that time, Ronald Reagan. Young would not fire her, but the regents took it upon themselves to dismiss her and not allow her to teach. But Charles Young was also known for working with students, interacting with students, meeting face-to-face with students, negotiating and resolving whatever conflict was set on the table, and oftentimes initiating pilot projects and programs. That was the University California at Los Angeles, which differed from other campuses where police came onto the campuses often. The National Guard came onto campus often. That would be, for example, the University of San Francisco. But at UCLA, although police and other armed forces came onto campus, it wasn't regularly invaded. And that was due in part to Chancellor Young and student groups meeting, negotiating, and working things out. Next slide. But in order to create diversity, one important thing had to happen. There had to be a coalition among the students. The student movement had to have a coalition, and that evolved in the 1960s, the late 1960s. Next slide. Multi-ethnic, multiracial student organizations came together. They demanded the establishment of research centers in ethnic studies. And there were 4 ethnic studies established in 1969. One, of course, was the Chicano Studies Research Center that I knew very intimately. Another one was the Asian American Studies Center. The third one was the African American Studies Center. And the fourth one was the American Indian Studies Center. These 4 units of the university have conducted research and other related activities and programs over 53 years. They remain quite visible and provide the university with a strong resource. But in addition, now there are 4 departments. There is a Department of Chicano Studies, the Cesar Chavez Department of Chicana and Chicano Studies and Central American Studies. Now you can receive a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, and a PhD in Chicano Studies at UCLA. Next slide. Dr. Martin Luther King came to UCLA to visit in 1966. Next slide. He won the hearts and the minds of many students at UCLA and various other campuses where he spoke. Next slide. But in addition, there were significant activities occurring outside of the university in the areas that I knew well, Boyle Heights and East Los Angeles. In March 1968, thousands of students walked out of East Los Angeles high schools and middle schools. These were the so-called Mexican schools. They were informally identified within the school district as the Mexican schools. The leaders of these protests were high school students, young people, 16, 17 years old, some as young as 15. They had participated in the Chicano Youth Leadership Conference of 1966 and 1967, where they were mentored by a Lincoln High School teacher, Sal Castro. Now, originally, the Chicano Youth Leadership Conference that was established in 1963 was established in the hope of creating role model citizens from Mexican American communities, upright young citizens. But when Sal Castro gained control of this conference, he began to ask students to ask themselves questions as to what was their history, where did they come from, what was happening to them, and what was happening in their schools. Were they being prepared for college? Essential questions, asking them about their futures. And in 1968, a sufficient number of students said, this cannot happen, this cannot continue. What schools are doing to us is not acceptable. It is not equitable, it is not fair. Next slide. So there we had walkouts 1968, beginning in March the 1st. Students walked out for an entire week. Now this photo was taken by Deborah Weber, and it's from the collection of La Raza magazine photos that are at the Chicano Studies Research Center. Deborah was a student at UCLA. She went on to receive her PhD and was a faculty member at the University of California, Riverside, where she retired. Next slide. Over 5 days, 15,000 students walked out of their schools. Next slide. They demanded an end to inferior education, an end to discriminatory practices, and they called for equal educational opportunities. Prepare us for college, prepare us for what we decide is best for us. Next slide. The community demonstrations continued after the student walkouts. Adults, community residents, became involved. Next slide. And there was a broad coalition of community groups and their supporters who continued to apply pressure for educational change. Next slide. Now, there was the farm worker union effort, of course, was very important to the student movement of the 1960s. Next slide. Cesar Chavez spoke at UCLA several times, and I saw him speak in 1972. Next slide. My wife, Gloria there, and I were married in 1974, and the following year we were involved in demonstrations in support of the farm workers. We were involved in boycott activities. Next slide. This is 1976 when we joined the huge demonstration in Delano for support of the farm workers. Next slide. As we were walking down the demonstration line, came across Joan Baez, a very well-known folk singer, singing to the participants. Next slide. Now, there was a rigorous program that I had to deal with at UCLA. rigorous academic program. And in 1968, I found myself so far behind in my studies that I went through a period of where I more or less thought of myself as a monk, because I had a goal. I had a goal to go on to graduate school, and I had to concentrate on the coursework that I had. I concentrated and I did succeed. I made it into graduate school and received both my master's degree and PhD from the School of Education, UCLA. Next slide. To review a history of Chicana and Chicano movement, please refer to this book, Making Aztlán. It was written by Professor Juan Gomez Quiñones at UCLA. Unfortunately, my compadre passed in the year 2020, but he was godfather to my older daughter, Marisol, pictured here. Next slide. But our family activism in the community continues. This is a photograph of Marisol with her uncle in a demonstration against Proposition 187, 1994. And the proposition would have eliminated services, including education, for undocumented people. Next slide. I began my career at UCLA in 1975. As mentioned, I began as the assistant director at the Chicano Studies Research Center, then became an assistant dean of international studies and overseas programs. And for the final phase of my career at UCLA, I came back to the Chicano Studies Research Center, where I retired, but not really retired. I continued to support the center and coordinated 3 additional conferences, including a major conference in 2008, celebrating the 50th anniversary of the walkouts, 2018. Next slide. But I also taught, and this I think is what provided me with a sense that I was really contributing to the development of students at UCLA. My first course was in 1977. It was entitled The Mexican American in the Schools. I continued teaching. This is a class that I offered in 2005. Next slide. This is in 2009, reviewing material on the 40th anniversary of ethnic studies at UCLA. Next slide. Continuing that class meeting at a museum. Next slide. But one thing that staff at the university look forward to is Raza graduation at UCLA, where Poly Pavilion is filled with students and their families. Next slide. It allows us the opportunity to join with them, full regalia, cap and gown. Next slide. We meet with students that we have encouraged and developed and trained. This is Oscar, and he graduated from UCLA, went on. Next slide. We join with colleagues that we've worked with for many years. This is Professor Reynaldo Macias. He was chair of the Chicano Studies Department for a number of years and also served as the Dean of Social Sciences at UCLA. Next slide. I've worked with many graduate students, and they have been research assistants on projects and research assistants on conferences and programs that I've planned and implemented. But one of the graduate students that I'm very proud of is the young woman with the red band on her shoulder. Next slide. I'm very proud of her because she wrote her own history. Sal Castro would ask his students, do you know your history? If you don't know your history, write it. Go to college, write your own history. Well, Nadine wrote her own history. Next slide. She wrote her dissertation, received her PhD. Her dissertation was on the Mendes Westminster school desegregation case, and she focused in on the Mexican American women involved, the mothers, the aunts, the sisters, the older sisters who were involved, who were really at the forefront of leading the fight against school segregation. And this is an unfortunate statistic that I want the young women in the audience to look at. When Nadine received her dissertation, she was one of 0.03 Chicanas with a PhD, 2015. It was a struggle for her. It continues to be a struggle. And we certainly do need more Latinas, more Chicanas with PhDs, with higher education. Next slide. There is an acknowledgement page in her dissertation. Next slide. And Nadine Bermudez acknowledges the support that we gave her. This is something that is so, sometimes I'm overcome when I read it, but it is something that we, as staff of the university, really love to receive. Thank you, Nadine. Next slide. Now, Mr. Castro would ask his students, do you know your history? Next slide. He wrote his own history. Next slide. Through the walkouts. As a Lincoln High School teacher, he helped prepare not only Lincoln High School students, but students from Garfield, from Roosevelt, and from other schools to be leaders, to take action, to improve their situation, to change education for the better, to make it equitable. He was arrested in 1968 along with 12 others, so it was the 13 that were arrested for conspiracy charges, conspiracy to plan and to implement the walkouts of 1968. 2 years later, the case was dismissed. Free speech and the rights to assembly. Next slide. Years later, the same school district that tried to fire him and ostracized him built a school and named it after Sal Castro. Next slide. And he was acknowledged for writing his own history. President Bill Clinton and Sal Castro. Next slide. Sal Castro passed in 2013. 80 years, a life well lived. He was devoted to his students throughout his life. A model high school teacher. Next slide. If you want readings on the walkouts, this is the book to see. Next slide. Sal Castro would ask his students, do you know about the Mendes versus Westminster case? Do you know about that segregation of Mexicans into Mexican schools? Next slide. Sylvia Mendes. The 1947 image of Mendes was a little girl, and then the 2007 image of Sylvia Mendes, the woman that I met. In the 1947 picture, Sylvia is part of a class in an integrated school. But previous to that, in her previous years in school, she was forced to go to a Mexican school, segregated away from white students. Next. The court case of 1946 that the Mexican-American community fought in Westminster and other communities, Santa Ana included, the court found that the arbitrary separation of children of Mexican descent into Mexican schools violated their right to equal protection as guaranteed by the 14th Amendment. This was new as a finding of the court. Very important. There was no evidence that existed that showed segregation aided in the development of English proficiency, which was one of the reasons that Mexican children were being segregated into Mexican schools, supposedly so that they could learn English. And segregation fostered antagonisms. Mexican children were thought of as the other, lesser other, that they couldn't learn. And the district segregated because of Latinized and Mexican names. That was the finding of the court in 1946. It was upheld on appeal in 1947 by an appeals court decision. Next slide. This is the recommended reading on the Mendez case. Next slide. Selcras would ask the students, of course, did you know that Mendez was the precursor to the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education, the U.S. Supreme Court case? Now, Sylvia Mendez devoted her life to assuring that the Mendez case was not forgotten. Next slide. Sylvia often spoke at the Chicano Youth Leadership Conference. She spoke at other conferences, but not only in the state of California, but she traveled on her own dime, on her own. Next slide. She also visited classes. Here she was attending one of my classes and making a presentation on Mendez, but she went to other colleges and universities and spoke on Mendez. Next slide. Sylvia Mendez wrote her own history. She was recognized. Next slide. President Barack Obama recognized the importance of the Mendez case and the work of Sylvia Mendez. Next slide. She received the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2011. Next slide. Now, the last person I want to talk about is my high school classmate from Roosevelt High School, longtime friend and colleague, Don Nakanishi. Next slide. Now, Don Nakanishi also passed 2016, but before that, he was a professor and director of the Asian American Studies Center at UCLA, and we worked together for many years on campus. But while I went to UCLA, 29 miles away, he traveled across the country to go to Yale University. And then he went to Harvard University for a PhD. Next slide. I mentioned that in the 1960s, there was renewed interest in recruiting minority students. The prestigious institutions, including Yale and Harvard, started to recruit. And Don became part of Yale's most diverse class. Out of 1,000 men, there were 7 African Americans, 7 Latinos, and 7 Asian Americans. This was Yale's most diverse class. But that core, that small core of ethnic and racial minority students, that core provided the base for change at Yale and at other universities. There was a core of students acting up for change. Next slide. Nakanishi is known for establishing the Asian American studies as a viable and relevant field of scholarship. He co-founded the AmeriAsia Journal, which is now the preeminent journal in Asian American studies. Next slide. But we were always giving back to where we came from. Don and I, apart from working at the university, worked together in our communities, Loyal Heights, East Los Angeles. We worked with several nonprofits. We helped establish a major scholarship program in East Los Angeles. In addition, we also have scholarships named after us at Roosevelt High School. Both of us have named scholarships at Roosevelt. We both have named scholarships at UCLA. And Don has a named scholarship at Harvard University. Next slide. Don Nakanishi wanted to be remembered as a mentor to a new generation of Asian American scholars, and he did that. A good friend. Thank you. That's the end of my slide presentation.
Can I just, before Giovanna takes us into questions, I can't help myself. I just have to say, wow. I'm like, so much information, so much history wrapped up in your brain. It's so impressive. And I'm just so thankful that you're with us tonight to share this, because it's great stuff. So Giovanna, we've got like 16, 17 questions. It's filling up in the Q&A. Why don't you take us through those questions?
Okay. So the first question is, who inspired you the most?
What I tried to do tonight was create a slide program that focused in on my experiences, and particularly those experiences of the 60s and 70s. For inspiration at various times in my life, I'd have to say there were different people, different individuals. For my high school inspiration, it was the teacher, Mr. Kelly, who sat down with me and encouraged me and said, "You can do it." He was a UCLA alumni. I suppose if he had been an alumni of USC, he would have recruited me for USC. But he was very confident in me and affirmed my capabilities. That was important counseling to receive. And he also helped me in a very meaningful way, helping me to fill out the application for UCLA, because no one in my family had been to college. No one had gone beyond high school. In fact, both my mother and father did not have education beyond several years of schooling. So what we're talking about here is someone, myself, who had no idea of what I needed to do in terms of getting into college. I was highly motivated to learn in high school, and I did get admitted into the college prep programs because I was very competitive in an academic way. But I was still lost. Here I was with the grades necessary to get into college, but I didn't know what to do. And so I thank that one teacher, Mr. Kelly. Later on, there would be other individuals that would be very helpful. At the graduate school level, the most important relationship that you have as a student is with their advisor. And the advisor I had, Tom LaBelle, was very crucial, very important for me to get my dissertation done, get it submitted, and get it approved. So one in high school and one maybe 8 years later at the graduate school level. So each way along the path of life, including our academic careers, we should and we can and we must meet up with individuals that will help us make the next step.
Thank you. The next question is, how do you feel about the difference in the schools that you attended?
Which schools? You're talking about Roosevelt?
Yes, I think so.
Okay. Well, Roosevelt is very different today than it was in the middle 60s when I was attending as a student. As I mentioned, it was overcrowded. It had twice the population of students that it was built for. How do you deal with overcrowded conditions? You can't provide the kind of education and schooling that those students need if they're overcrowded. Another thing is the facilities were poor, were old, 1920s. The library was old. And of course, they lacked programs that would help students that were interested in going to college. My thinking now, as I assess the situation of Roosevelt, Garfield, Lincoln, and other barrio schools that were attended by Mexican-American students, primarily Latino students today, was that in those days, in the 1960s and into the 70s, the primary purpose of the schools was for custodial care, to take care of children from morning until afternoon while their parents worked. And often enough, it was to give them vocational education, train them to be blue-collar workers, or direct them in areas not necessarily for higher education. Mechanics was a big thing during the time that I was in school, learning to auto repair. Now, you definitely need an auto repairman, but to funnel students into vocational education and limit the training and preparation for college preparation is wrong. And students saw that. Now, in addition, there were attitudes, perceptions, and biases of the staff against Mexican students. You couldn't speak Spanish in school. Otherwise, you were swatted. Corporal punishment was allowed in those days. Some teachers actually were biased. They were discriminatory. They thought that Mexicans could not learn. That was their attitude, and that came across in their teaching, unfortunately. So in 1968, students acted. They rebelled against it. They acted and demanded that the schools change. Now today, the situation is very, very different. The students at the university, the students that I worked with as an undergraduate in 1968, demanded change at the University of California. These changes came about. It wasn't only the research centers and then later the departments for ethnic studies, but students in 1968 were demanding that the university recruit students from barrio schools, admit students from barrio schools, provide support for them at the university, give them scholarships. The university was not doing that previous to 1968 in large numbers. So the programs that exist today of recruitment, retention, and support, those programs were seeded, initiated in 1968. So students today in colleges and universities can thank students from the 1960s for the benefits that they have, the scholarships that they are receiving, the admissions programs that they have. In addition, students in 1968 at the university level were demanding a change in staff, in the faculty. There were two Mexican-American faculty at UCLA. One was in the School of Education, and one was a mathematician in the math department. So, students were demanding more Mexican-American faculty. Where are they? Why don't you develop them? Why don't you prepare them? Why don't you train them? Why don't you have them trained in the PhDs, go on to become academics themselves? That was important. That was an important change. Without faculty at a university, you're not going to get the recruitment done to draw in students. So you needed to have faculty and you needed to have staff. That has dramatically changed at UCLA and other campuses today from the scene that we had in the 1960s. So I'm very proud of the changes that have occurred, and I'm also pleased to note that UCLA in a relatively not too distant future, will become a Hispanic serving institution because it'll have a significant population enrollment of Latino students, Hispanic students.
The next question is, what advice would you give students who hope to make a difference?
Now, what advice would I give who?
What advice would you give students who hope to make a difference in their community?
Well, as Sal Castro would say, no sean mensos, go to college and graduate. That's the first step. No, that was toned down, politically correct, because his earlier slogan had been much, much harsher. But first step, go to college, prepare yourself, then write your history. And it can be a bachelor's degree, it can be a master's degree, it can be a PhD. Gain access, make yourself important. And then in addition, what my good friend Don Nakanishi and I did throughout our careers was be involved in nonprofit organizations that work for the betterment of the community. And what Don and I also did was establish and support students via scholarships and some fellowships. You have to promote and support the next generation. But the first step is educate yourself, prepare yourself, go to college.
Thank you so much, Dr. Haro. I think that's all we have time for tonight. I want to, I don't know if you're aware of this, but you mentioned, was it Nadine, the student you had who got her PhD? Did I get that name right? So my daughter, who's Latina, she was given the Mellon Mays Fellowship. So for those students out there, this is a program that encourages minority students on the PhD path, and they get a stipend, and they get a mentor, and they get, like she's applying right now for her graduate program at UCLA, wink, wink, wink. I don't know if you can help her out, but I'm just teasing. But she's applying at all the UCs, but they help with application fees and all of that. And so if you're a minority student out there, check out things like Mellon Mays. There's several other programs like that that are out there to help increase the number of minority students in the PhD programs and pathways. So I never knew those existed until my daughter found them. So just a heads up. Or were you aware of those as well, Dr. Haro?
Say again?
Were you aware of programs like that, like the fellowship, like Mellon Mays? And
yes, at UCLA there are several like that different graduate programs have them, and the graduate division at UCLA does support that kind of thing.
Yeah, so if you know that you want to be on a graduate pathway, make sure you look into those students out there. So my deepest thanks to you, Dr. Haro. I honestly wish you were still teaching. I would probably try to enroll at UCLA and take your class. It's just so fascinating, so interesting. I wrote down the name of all the books, and I want to do the reading. But I truly appreciate your time and your talents and your ability to speak with our students tonight. Thank you to all of our Adelante friends in the audience, and to Dr. Haro's daughter, Marisol, who's also in the audience. She's our Glendale Latinos Association president. I get to spend Saturday with her for 4 hours during our GLA retreat. I'm very excited about that. So hello to her and all of our Adelante friends out there, our teachers, Sandra Dermis-Ropian, and our other friends. So thank you to Mr. Hernandez for working the tech. Thank you to Giovanna for being an amazing moderator. If you're a student out there and you're interested in being a moderator for one of our speakers, please reach out to myself or Mr. Gallimore. We can certainly use all the help we can get. So thank you again, everyone. If you're a CV student, we're headed off to a football game tonight in an hour. And then we have our Glendale Dia de los Muertos coming up on November 5th. and our Glendale Public Libraries is putting that on. If you have an organization and you want to create an altar or an ofrenda, please reach out to them. Or if you just want to come and check out the ofrendas and eat some really great food and enjoy some really great performances, feel free to join us that day. We would love to see you all there. Thank you again, everyone. Oh, next week we have Ignacio Gomez, who is an artist and a sculptor and a muralist, joining us at 5 p.m. next Thursday, September 29th via Zoom. We will see you all next week. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful weekend. Again, Dr. Haro, gracias. Muchas gracias. Thank you, everyone. Have a